Please welcome to the stage Jonathan Foer, author, and Liev Schreiber, actor, writer, and director.
Hello. Can everybody hear?
Hi.
Okay. Thank you for having us. Thank you to Bloomberg Green. Thank you for coming to this event. I've known Liev for about 25 years. And we have been close friends, best friends, pretty much ever since we met. And he's my favorite person in the world to have difficult conversations with. And so I have been looking forward to this opportunity because we're going to talk about, as every speaker today talked about, a very difficult subject. I wanted to start by asking you to share with the audience a feeling that you described to me. This was, I guess, a week or two ago. You were in Riyadh to see Alexander Usyk fight for the heavyweight championship. And you said at the time that you found yourself overwhelmed by the sense that he was going to win that fight. You had faith in his ability to do so and that he was the good guy. And yet, immediately after the fight, you had a kind of opposite side of the coin feeling that the good guy, broadly speaking, is not going to win. I've found myself continuing to think about that quite a bit since you told it to me. Can you open it up a bit for everybody here?
You've kind of sanitized the story a little bit, because what I told you was that I had this 3-week period of depression after Usyk won the undisputed heavyweight title. And just to establish some things about Usyk, he's this incredibly, he's undefeated his entire career. The average fighter has about 40 amateur fights in their portfolio. Alexander Usyk has 330. So he's somebody who lives, breathes, thinks everything boxing, and he's the best in the world. And the guy he's going up against is a 1.5 feet taller and probably 30 or 40 pounds heavier. But I'm convinced that Alexander is going to win because of his talent, because of how he carries himself as a person, that he has this he has respect and dignity and nobility, and also because I am doing a lot of work for Ukraine, and Usyk has come to mean something to me. And I was very nervous at the beginning that he wasn't going to win, and that the other guy was too big, and the other guy's a great fighter, but kind of a PR machine. He's all talk and all this other stuff. And so I really was invested in Usyk winning. And he invited me to walk out with him, and I was terrified because I thought, what if I jinx him? This guy's never lost a fight. And what if I go with him and he loses? So it was a scary night. And then he won, and it was this hugely triumphant feeling. My wife and I are screaming and jumping up and down in a Saudi crowd, which is kind of unusual. And the moment he won, I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling of disappointment that the real world wasn't like that. That this sort of empirical person, this empirical fighter, this guy who just practices and works and does it all right, does it by the book, behaves the right way, trains the right way, practice. Of course he's going to win. And for some reason, right after he won, I had this huge sinking feeling about how ironic it is that it isn't like that in real life. How awful it was, and I guess I was thinking primarily of the situation in Ukraine. And that, because I've been working on it for 2 years, really has stayed with me pretty much for the past 3 weeks or a month. And a very powerful feeling.
As I said, it really resonated with me when you described it, and it's something that I have felt increasingly over the last few years, that it's just overwhelming. You know, the problems of the world are overwhelming. Climate change is overwhelming.
Right.
The situation in Ukraine is overwhelming. The threats to democracy are overwhelming. And so, and not only overwhelming in terms of scale, but overwhelming in terms of a kind of vagueness and a distance and not knowing my own relationship or how to participate. And that alienation or that feeling of smallness often leads me to sort of recede, to say, this is too big, it's too much, it feels too dire, the good guys are going to lose, so I'm going to kind of watch from the sidelines and occasionally say the right thing when it's asked of me. But then you told me this other story.
But that's not what you've done, by the way.
Well,
and I should say that I was invited to this, and I think I was invited because I've done a few things on climate, but primarily probably because of the CNN show that I've been hosting. And I called them back and I said, I don't know anyone who speaks more articulately or whose heart is deeper in this subject than Jonathan. Would you guys consider having us as a conversation? So that's sort of how this happened, just as some context.
As a favor, would you allow my friend to share this? Yeah. So
I never paid him for our wedding. He was the minister at the wedding. So I thought, I'll get you that gig at Bloomberg. Let's see how.
So there's this other story that you've told me recently that I think of as a kind of counterpoint to the boxing despair.
Yeah.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'm curious what you think, and that's the story of cleaning up the beach in Montauk.
That's really all it is my wife suggested that we do beach cleanups as kind of a weekly thing with the kids. And I think that was, probably 7 years ago we started doing that. And it was this kind of triumphant feeling that I was doing something, that I was engaged. And I think it's part of what probably led to developing Blue Check and some other things, this idea that on this very sort of selfish and individual level, I could model something for my kids, that made me feel better. And also, it was also a great consequence that my beach looked better, and I felt engaged with the ocean, and I felt engaged with my environment. And I think sometimes when I feel overwhelmed by things or that they're too big for me to figure out how to participate, it's those little actions sometimes that really help make me feel connected.
Yeah, it seems like both stories have to do with power in a way, or participation. You know, in the case of the boxing match, he's literally the most powerful fighter, the most powerful person by one definition on the planet, who's engaging in a contest which is going to have a clear winner or loser. The beach cleanup is, you know, as small an act of civic responsibility as they come, worthwhile as it is, and more than I often do. But it's a tiny act, and one that, like most tiny acts, can leave one feeling unsure of what the ultimate meaning is. You know, like climate change has so very many moving parts. It's such a simple problem in certain ways, but it's such a complicated problem in other ways. As an individual facing it and questioning what role we might have, it feels overwhelmingly complicated. And if I get an electric car, if I become a vegetarian, if I limit the number of children I have to 2, whatever it is, to what extent is that going to matter in the sense of an overall victory or defeat? I think these ideas might come together in a paper that you shared with me recently. You made me aware of the concept of planetary boundaries, developed by Johan Rockström, among others, and it creates a framework of 9 areas that describe these thresholds of human activities on the Earth systems beyond which the Earth can no longer function properly or regulate itself. I've known you for many years. I've known you for many years since climate change was at the center of our sort of collective consciousness, and it's the first thing you've ever shared with me, frankly, on the subject. I was curious, well, what was it about that you were responding to and that you thought I would respond to?
I'm someone who likes instructions. I like manuals. I read, my family makes fun of me because I read all of the manuals. And I think the story about Usyk for me is about somebody who for some reason I see as an empirical truth. And it should matter. Like Usyk is the scientist to me. And that's why he's successful. Because he respects the science of the sport. And I think Johan Rockström, amongst many other climate scientists, is a similar sort of figure. And what he's accomplished with the Planetary Boundaries is, and part of what Jonathan and I, when we first started to talking about this, is that rather than throwing data and facts at people, we wanted to talk about the feeling of responding to this problem and how do we deal with that feeling. So it was this idea that we would have a very open conversation about it. But what helps me with my extensive ADHD and anxiety and everything else in responding to things that are overwhelming are guidelines. And what I loved about the Planetary Boundaries and the Potsdam Institute and Johan's work is that they define 9 interrelated systems that we can look at to understand how and when we need to seriously deal with some of these issues. Now, we're over 6 of those limits, so it's pretty serious. And I recommend, if anyone wants, there's a terrific documentary called Breaking Boundaries, which is about Johan Rockström's work on Netflix. But what it gave me was a way to encapsulate the problem, a way to think about it, and to think about what area I can participate in or what piece of this puzzle makes sense to me and I can try to address in my own life. And I found that thing that you were talking about, which is when something becomes overwhelming and you kind of turn and face the wall or apathy sets in, simplification and just being able to understand context really helped me a lot. I think another thing that Jean Olwang from Virgin United, who's one of the people involved in the Planetary Guardians, said to me that really moved me at the time was the idea of optimism. And where she made that point, she brought up the Montreal Protocol. And when we become so overwhelmed by all of the information that we're getting about climate and our planet and everything else, it's very easy to do exactly what you're saying, which is to sort of retreat into apathy. But then you hear these incredible stories, for instance, that the scientists who identified the problem with CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and the hole in our ozone. I mean, a hole in the ozone seems like a pretty insurmountable, overwhelming problem. But that within 2 years, we had ratified, sort of universally ratified, the Montreal Protocol, which was, by the way, spearheaded by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who you don't exactly think of as the world's most effective climate warriors, but sure enough. And within 3 years, we had completely reduced that hole, closed it up, and we made this huge improvement in this seemingly galactic problem. And so I like to keep that in mind. And I think that was what hurt so much about Usyk, even though he won. It was that I had been the only person in my crew who carried that flame of optimism for Ukraine. I had been the one beating the drum going, I know these people, they're going to win. They're going to win. It doesn't matter. The odds don't matter. They're going to win. So on that night, I kind of had that feeling that, like, empirical truths don't matter. Misinformation, disinformation, all of the shit that's sort of driving our culture in these things have got us all spun. And that was, I think, the haze. Coming out of it, though. I mean,
one of the things that I found compelling about the Planetary Boundaries was it offered a way not only to think about how to care for the planet, but also is a kind of metaphor for how to be a person in the world right now. And this comes back to that feeling we were discussing at the beginning about being overwhelmed. There's so many problems. They're so vast. We are not experts. That's one of the things you and I spoke about in advance of today. Like, we don't want to pretend to be experts, which has a wisdom, obviously, but it can also be an excuse, you know, to say nothing, to do nothing. So one of our most frequent topics of conversation is the proliferation of identities that we each have. We are fathers, we are artists, we are Americans, New Yorkers. There's a long list. And oftentimes those identities are in harmony. Sometimes those identities are in conflict. Sometimes one of those identities will ask something especially large of us. Sometimes it will ask more than we are able to give. And there really is a sense in which, as I was thinking about the planetary guidelines, that, you know, our lives are also ecosystems that require a sort of balance, self-regulation. You are an extraordinarily busy person with many, many demands, and you're somebody who is, your eyes are wide open to the world, and you have a sensitivity to the world. So how do you strike those balances? And is there anything, did you have any kind of like similar reaction that I did to that concept of planetary guidelines, taking it as a personal guidance?
Yeah.
Boundaries.
The identities thing, I mean, I'm in the identities business, right? Because I play characters, and in many ways, my life has thankfully been that, is a series of opportunities to explore character and who I am. And there's this very selfish, sort of narcissistic part of me that likes the identity of teaching my kids to respect nature and that they have a sense of stewardship and responsibility towards it. I like that I feel that way, and I get something from that. I get something from teaching them or showing them that compassion is kind of an essential part of who we are as human beings, or, you know, at least in our family. I hope that they have that feeling. So that part of it is selfish, but I also think it's a motivator. Like I lean into it. I like I like thinking that my kids are understanding that. I think in terms of the planetary boundaries, what they're trying to do with that right now is to get that through the Security Council, the highest level of governance that they can, so that it functions in the sort of the same way that the Montreal Protocol did. But what I related to with the planetary boundaries was this thing about bits, you know, like taking on little bits. And we had a really interesting conversation about this when we first started talking about it, about how it was a lot like maintaining your health. You know, you had all different kinds of doctors. You know, you have the cardiologist, you have the proctologist, you have the dermatologist, and in a funny way, it actually made it easier to tackle everything that's going wrong. Holistically, it's almost too much, but if I could just deal with the hemorrhoids, I'd be okay.
Well, it's like they say nobody dies of old age.
Until they tell me about the heart.
Right.
And then I deal with the heart. But I focus on the heart until they tell me about the skin cancer. And then I forget about the heart and the hemorrhoids and I think about the skin cancer. And that's just because I'm a human being. I don't have the capacity for all of that. I don't have that range of thought or wisdom or energy. I need to break it down. And I really appreciate Johan Rockström's work because it really makes it very clear.
So there is also a risk in breaking things down into pieces that are too small, right? Feeling like satisfied with gestures that are creating feelings that are larger than their actual impact. It's naive to say, if we each do our small part, we're going to save the planet. We also need legislated change. We need corporate change, systemic change. At the same time, we know that we can't save the planet without changing as individuals. We will never reach the goals, for example, of the Paris Climate Accords if we continue to eat as we have been eating, the amount of meat and the kinds of meat that we have been eating. And then there's also the element of the things that we do as individuals are not exactly done as individuals. So when I am in a restaurant and I ask the waiter, what's the vegetarian option tonight? The person I'm sitting across from the table from hears me ask that question, is presumably at least a little bit curious. The waiter obviously hears me ask that question, takes note of it. It drip by drip reaches the chef, it reaches the person who's buying the food for the restaurant, it reaches the farmers. When you clean up litter on the beach, you are doing...
Or write a book about factory farming.
Or write a book about factory farming. Yeah. When you clean up litter on the beach, it's a small act, but it's a small act that is witnessed. And it's a small act that inspires. And we live in a moment, for better or for worse, usually for worse, where our choices have never been as recorded and shared.
Right.
So if I have a preference, if I decide to become a vegetarian, who's going to know about it? Without my having to tell them. Amazon will know about it. Google will know about it.
Right.
Apple will know about it. Facebook will know about it. So it does offer a little bit of promise, if you want to be like very optimistic about it, that our small actions are actually larger than we might suspect.
Of course they are. Collectively, they have. At the end of that Breaking Boundaries documentary, David Attenborough sort of breaks it down even further and says that of the four simple things that any person can do by reducing their carbon footprint, by eating healthier, they're all positive things. But it's amazing how, if you imagine exponentially, that if everyone takes on one of those things that selfishly fits their lifestyle, what a difference it can make. I really do believe that's the case. And even the awareness.
And activism, caring and acting on one's care is kind of muscle that gets stronger. Tolstoy famously said, or at least it's attributed to him, if we had no slaughterhouses, we would have no battlefields. I don't suspect that that's true, but what I suspect is true if people were...
Why did Tolstoy say if we have no...
If we could become a civilization...
So if eating red meat makes us angry.
If we could become a civilization that was thoughtful about suffering broadly, we would be less likely to incur violence against each other.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And,
Sorry, I missed that one completely.
So I doubt that that's...
This is why we're friends.
Yeah. One thing I hear people say all the time is, if I have to think about that, then I'm going to have to think about that. Like, oh my God, now they're telling me I can't use plastic straws. If I can't use plastic straws, I'm already thinking about my car. I'm already thinking about air travel. I'm already, right, as if it never stops.
I'm thinking about how much I miss plastic straws. But I don't. I use the seaweed ones.
No.
I don't like the ones that you have to wash with the pipe cleaner.
Yeah, I don't like the ones that disintegrate in your mouth, that aren't made for liquids.
Those are the cheap seaweed straws.
It makes no sense at all.
Either.
So...
Yeah, get us out of straws.
Get us out of straws. Okay, actually our time is clicking away. Oh. Let's talk about hope, because that is something that I find myself vacillating about pretty dramatically. I could wake up feeling full of hope when I watched the previous panelists.
Yep, they were
I felt full of hope.
Yeah.
A reminder that there are such smart young people so thoroughly devoted to the problems that we share.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel hopeful, and there are so many reasons to feel despair as well. And I've also grown sort of suspicious of hope, or at least recognize how it's a double-edged sword.
Well, we're getting older.
We're getting older.
Yeah, that's kind of hope-killing,
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But I agree, and listening to the last panel, but for me, it's science. That's our hope. That's our hope, is science, empirical data. And it's like, that's what did it in 1989 with the Montreal Protocol. We trusted the scientists. We listened to them. They told us there was a big problem, and our leaders reacted. Things have shifted a little bit, and so hope is a little scary. But I still have faith in that process. I have faith in science.
I have perfect faith in science, but I don't have faith in our ability to listen to science.
Right.
Or to respond to science, especially when it asks things of us. We were speaking at lunch about how some of what's asked of us with respect to the climate actually feels good to participate in. Technology is making it such that a lot of the changes we have to make can actually enhance our lives rather than diminish our lives. But there are some things that we have to do that are just difficult. Or at the very least, they're difficult in the beginning.
Like what?
I would say for most people, eating differently is difficult.
Yes.
Otherwise, we would have done it already.
Yes.
Like the science couldn't possibly be more clear about the effects of animal agriculture on the climate.
Right.
And yet, even among climate scientists, it proves to be a very hard thing to respond to. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're ignorant. It's because...
And it's probably the single most effective thing we could do as individuals.
Almost certainly the most effective thing we can do as individuals.
I think so.
Yeah. And yet it's hard. And so...
Awful.
We have to find a kind of... It seems to me that, like, hope... We often confuse or conflate hope with kind of inspiration. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel hopeful when I'm sure that people are bright enough, young enough, good enough, energetic enough to tackle these seemingly insurmountable problems. But there's also a component of hope that I think has to be like a forgiveness, like especially a self-forgiveness of our own humanity. These are difficult changes that are being asked of us within our families, within ourselves, within our local communities, and so on. And if we don't start by an acknowledgement of how difficult they are,
right.
If we say the science tells us to do this, as an aside, when Eating Animals came out, J.M. Coetzee, the Nobel Prize-winning author, one of my favorite authors, wrote a blurb for it. And he said, you would have to not have a mind or a heart to read this book and not become a vegetarian. And I thought, I don't actually think that's a great thing to say.
Because it isolates some people.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that I have a mind and a heart, and I have a very hard time being consistent about my values, acting on my values.
We have the same therapist.
Yeah, it's me.
No, it's not, Dave. We're not going to say his name because then we'll never get our times. But one of the things that he always says is, one of the things that he said to me that I always thought was really effective that you just raised is to forgive yourself. Because I think that puts you in the place where you know what to do. To take a moment to stop and go, it's okay. It's okay that I wasn't able to accomplish this, or I didn't do that, or haven't done that. I'm okay right where I am. And then that feeling kind of empowers you to go forward. I feel like we were talking before about confidence, how important confidence is. I think for me, as an artist, as an actor, as a boxer, confidence is huge. And I think again, that's where the science comes in. It's the empirical data to give us the confidence to know that we're doing the right thing.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the conversation. Thank you.